Welcome to the Long Road Stories. What you're about to hear is not fiction. This is a real account from America's highways, where lonely back roads hide secrets that defy explanation. Tonight, we bring you the story of Robert "Bobby" Castellano, a veteran trucker who took a shortcut that led him somewhere that shouldn't exist. This is his story, exactly as it happened. Before we begin, if you enjoy these real highway mysteries, please hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us what state or country you're watching from. We love hearing from truckers and road travelers all over the world. Now, the city that doesn't exist. Bobby Castellano had driven trucks for 26 years without incident. He knew the highways between Pittsburgh and Detroit like the back of his hand, could navigate them in any weather, at any time of day. But on November 12, 2022, Bobby made a decision that would change his life forever. Desperate to make his delivery deadline, he took an unmarked shortcut through rural Pennsylvania. 20 minutes later, he drove through a rusted iron gate into a town that shouldn't exist. A town frozen in time at 1912, where the streetlights burned with gas instead of electricity. Where the people who walked the cobblestone streets had pale, cadaveric skin and empty eye sockets with no eyeballs inside them. Where Bobby's GPS went haywire, his radio exploded with static, and every clock in his truck started spinning backwards. For 2 hours, Bobby drove in circles through impossible streets, watched by hollow-eyed figures in clothes from another century, unable to find his way out. When he finally escaped back to the modern highway, the shortcut he had taken had vanished completely, as if it had never existed. But Bobby wasn't the first to find that town. He discovered 2 documented cases of people who had entered Ashford Iron Works and never returned. And now Bobby knows the truth. There are places in America that exist outside of time, traps waiting for travelers who stray from the main roads. And some of those travelers are still there, driving forever through streets that no longer appear on any map. The call came through at 4:30 in the afternoon on a gray November Tuesday. Bobby Castellano was sitting in his Peterbilt at a truck stop outside Pittsburgh, eating a sandwich and reviewing his delivery schedule for the week. His phone lit up with a text from dispatch. "Urgent load. Auto parts to Detroit. Must arrive by 8 a.m. tomorrow. Premium pay." Bobby calculated the distance in his head. Pittsburgh to Detroit was approximately 280 miles via Interstate 79 north to Erie, then west on Interstate 90. Under normal conditions, that was a 5 to 6 hour drive, which would put him in Detroit around midnight with plenty of time to spare before his 8 o'clock delivery window. But Bobby had been monitoring the traffic reports, and Interstate 79 was backed up due to construction between Pittsburgh and Erie. The delays could add 2 or 3 hours to his trip, which would cut his arrival time dangerously close to his deadline. Bobby texted dispatch back accepting the load, then spent the next 20 minutes studying his road atlas, looking for alternatives. He had driven the Pittsburgh-Detroit route dozens of times, but always via the main interstates. Now he traced his finger along the map, following smaller state highways that cut through the rural areas of northwestern Pennsylvania. There were several options that could potentially save time, but they involved navigating unfamiliar roads at night through sparsely populated areas. Bobby weighed the risks and benefits, then made his decision. Robert Castellano, known as Bobby to everyone in the trucking community, was 49 years old and had been driving commercial trucks since age 23. He had started with local delivery routes in his home city of Philadelphia, then gradually worked his way up to long-haul interstate freight. Bobby was methodical and professional, with an excellent safety record and a reputation for always delivering on time. He took pride in his work and treated his truck like it was his own, maintaining it meticulously and keeping detailed logs of every mile driven. Bobby was divorced, his marriage having ended 7 years earlier when his wife Patricia finally tired of his long absences and the lonely nights spent in their suburban Philadelphia home while Bobby was somewhere on the road. They had no kids, which made the divorce simpler but also somehow sadder, as Bobby realized he had sacrificed his marriage for a career that left him with nothing but an empty apartment and a truck. But Bobby loved driving. He loved the solitude of the highway, the satisfaction of delivering cargo safely across vast distances, the sense of freedom that came from not being tied to an office or a factory. The road was his home now, and his truck was the closest thing he had to family. His current truck was a 2019 Peterbilt 579 with a sleeper cab, painted deep blue with chrome details. Bobby had named it Blue Thunder, though he never told anyone that fact, embarrassed by the sentimentality. The auto parts load was waiting at a warehouse on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. Bobby arrived at 5:45 and backed his trailer up to the loading dock with practiced precision. The warehouse crew had the parts already palleted and wrapped, and within 40 minutes Bobby's trailer was fully loaded and sealed. He performed his standard post-loading inspection, checking that the cargo was properly secured and that the trailer doors were locked. The paperwork indicated he was hauling brake components and electrical systems for the Ford assembly plant in Dearborn, Michigan, just outside Detroit. Total cargo weight was 38,000 pounds, well within the legal limit for his truck. Bobby signed the bill of lading, received his sealed envelope with the delivery instructions, and climbed back into his cab. It was 6:32 when Bobby pulled out of the warehouse parking lot and headed north toward the highway. The sun had already set, and the November darkness was settling over the industrial outskirts of Pittsburgh. Bobby turned on his headlights and merged onto the entrance ramp for Interstate 79 North. Almost immediately, he encountered the traffic backup that the reports had warned about. Construction had narrowed the 3-lane highway down to a single lane, and traffic was moving at perhaps 20 miles per hour. Bobby groaned and settled in for a long, slow crawl through the work zone. After 90 minutes of stop-and-go traffic, Bobby had covered only 35 miles. He was now north of the Pittsburgh suburbs, entering the rural regions of northwestern Pennsylvania. According to his GPS, he was still 2 hours from Erie even without traffic delays, and the construction zone showed no signs of ending. Bobby made a decision. At the next exit, he would leave the interstate and find one of the alternate routes he had studied on his map. The exit appeared at mile marker 78, a small interchange labeled simply State Route 423. Bobby took the exit and found himself on a 2-lane highway heading northwest through dark forests. There was no other traffic visible in either direction. Bobby consulted his GPS, but the device seemed confused, its screen flickering as it tried to recalculate his route. Finally, it displayed a route that showed him taking State Route 423 for approximately 40 miles, then connecting to State Route 19, which would take him to Erie. The projected arrival time in Detroit was now 11:15, still well ahead of his morning deadline. Bobby felt satisfied with his decision and pressed down on the accelerator, bringing his speed up to 55 miles per hour on the dark country highway. The forest on both sides of the road was dense and old growth, with massive trees that created a canopy overhead blocking out the stars. Bobby's headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating yellow center lines and occasional reflective road signs. Mile markers appeared at regular intervals, counting upward as Bobby drove deeper into the Pennsylvania wilderness. At mile marker 15, Bobby noticed that fog was beginning to form, wisps of white mist drifting across the road like ghosts. By mile marker 20, the fog had become thick enough that Bobby reduced his speed to 45 miles per hour, concerned about visibility. His GPS continued to show him en route, though the device was acting strangely, its screen brightness fluctuating and its estimated arrival time jumping erratically between different values. Bobby tried his CB radio, keying the microphone and calling out on channel 19. "This is Blue Thunder on State Route 423 northbound." "Anyone out there?" Only static answered him. Bobby wasn't particularly concerned. Rural areas often had poor radio reception, and the thick forest would block most signals. He focused on his driving, watching carefully for deer or other animals that might appear suddenly in the road. At mile marker 32, Bobby saw something that made him sit up straighter in his seat. A wooden sign appeared on the right side of the road, weathered and barely legible in his headlights. Bobby slowed down to read it. The sign said, "Shortcut to Route 19, 5 miles." Bobby considered the sign for a moment. A shortcut would be welcome, potentially saving him another 15 or 20 minutes. But the sign looked old, possibly abandoned, and Bobby had learned over his years of driving to be cautious about unmarked roads. Still, his deadline pressure and the promise of time savings made the decision for him. Bobby turned right onto the narrow road indicated by the sign. The shortcut was barely wide enough for his truck, with branches from overhanging trees scraping against the top of his trailer as he drove. The pavement was cracked and potholed, forcing Bobby to slow to 30 miles per hour to avoid damaging his suspension. His GPS screen had now gone completely blank, just a blue glow with no map displayed. Bobby turned on his truck's CB radio scanner, listening to it cycle through channels looking for any signal. Every channel was dead static. The only sound was the rumble of his engine and the scrape of branches against metal. Bobby checked his dashboard clock and saw that it read 7:53. He had been driving for about an hour and 20 minutes since leaving Pittsburgh, though it felt like longer. The fog had grown even thicker on this narrow road, reducing visibility to perhaps 50 feet. Bobby turned on his fog lights and leaned forward in his seat, straining to see the road ahead. He was beginning to regret taking this shortcut, but there was no way to turn around a 53-foot semi-truck on a road this narrow. His only option was to continue forward and hope the road connected to Route 19 as promised. After what felt like an eternity, but was actually about 12 minutes according to Bobby's watch, he saw lights ahead through the fog. Not the lights of oncoming traffic, but stationary lights that seemed to mark some kind of structure. As Bobby drew closer, the lights resolved into a pair of old-fashioned lampposts flanking a large iron gate that stretched across the road. The gate was ornate, made of wrought iron with decorative scrollwork, and appeared to be very old. Rust covered much of its surface, and sections of the metalwork had deteriorated with age. Spanning the top of the gate in iron letters was a name: Ashford Iron Works, Esther 1912. Bobby stopped his truck about 20 feet from the gate, letting the engine idle while he stared at the structure. The gate was standing open, both sides pulled back to allow vehicles to pass through. Beyond the gate, Bobby could see cobblestone pavement replacing the modern asphalt, and the glow of more lights in the distance suggested a town. Bobby had never heard of Ashford Iron Works, but the name suggested an industrial town, probably one of the many factory settlements that had dotted Pennsylvania in the early 20th century. Most of those towns were abandoned now, their factories closed and their populations dispersed. But the lights beyond the gate suggested this place was still inhabited, or at least still had working infrastructure. Bobby consulted his map, but Ashford Iron Works was not marked anywhere. He tried his GPS again, but the screen remained blank. His CB radio continued to produce only static. Bobby made a decision based on logic. If there was a town ahead, there would be a road through it, and that road would eventually connect to Route 19. Driving through was faster than turning back. Bobby released his brake and eased his truck forward through the iron gate. The moment his truck passed under the gate's arch, every piece of electronic equipment in his cab went haywire. The GPS screen flickered rapidly through dozens of different displays showing random locations. The CB radio screeched with feedback before going silent. The digital clock on his dashboard began running backwards, its numbers spinning in reverse. Bobby's phone, sitting in its holder on the dash, powered off by itself despite having been at 70% battery. Most disturbing, the engine computer started displaying error codes that Bobby had never seen before. Strange combinations of letters and numbers that scrolled across the small screen. Bobby's hands tightened on the steering wheel as a wave of unease washed over him. His first instinct was to brake, to stop and figure out what was happening to his truck's systems. But something deeper told him that stopping would be a mistake. Keep moving, his instinct said. Whatever this place is, keep moving through it. The road beyond the gate was indeed paved with cobblestones, rough and uneven under Bobby's tires. His speed dropped to 15 miles per hour as he navigated the primitive surface. On both sides of the road, buildings began to appear through the fog. Three-story structures made of brick and stone, with architectural styles from the early 1900s. Most had large windows on the ground floor, suggesting they had been shops or businesses. Upper floors showed smaller residential windows. The buildings were dark, no lights visible in any windows, but they appeared to be in good condition, not the crumbling ruins Bobby would have expected from a long-abandoned town. The streetlights that illuminated the cobblestone road were not modern electric lights but old gas lamps, their flames flickering inside glass enclosures atop iron posts. The yellow light they cast was warm but dim, creating pools of illumination separated by stretches of shadow. Bobby counted the streetlights as he passed them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the left side of the street, 6, 7, 8 on the right. The lamps extended ahead into the fog as far as Bobby could see, marking a route through the town. At least this made navigation easier. Bobby just had to follow the streetlights, and eventually they would lead him to the other side of town and back to modern roads. That's when Bobby saw the first person. The figure appeared at the edge of his headlight beam, standing on the sidewalk about 30 feet ahead. It was a man, Bobby thought, though the details were hard to make out in the fog and dim light. The figure was standing completely motionless, facing toward Bobby's truck. As Bobby's truck drew closer and his headlights illuminated the figure more clearly, Bobby felt his breath catch in his throat. The man was wearing clothes from another era, dark wool trousers and a work shirt, with suspenders and a flat cap. But it was the man's appearance that made Bobby's skin crawl. His face was pale, not just pale but unnaturally white, as if the person had been drained of all blood. The skin had a translucent quality, and Bobby could see dark veins beneath the surface like a network of black lines. But most disturbing were the eyes. Where eyes should have been, there were only empty sockets, dark voids in the white face. The man had no eyeballs, just hollow darkness where his eyes should be. Bobby wanted to look away but found he couldn't. His truck continued forward at its slow 15 miles per hour pace, and Bobby watched as the eyeless man's head turned to follow the truck's movement. The head moved smoothly, tracking Bobby's progress, and Bobby knew with absolute certainty that despite having no eyes, the thing could see him. Bobby forced himself to breathe, to focus on driving. "It's not real," he told himself. "It's a hallucination from stress and fatigue. Just keep driving." But the eyeless man was just the first. As Bobby continued down the main street of Ashford Ironworks, more figures appeared. They emerged from doorways and alleys, or simply materialized out of the fog, all of them standing motionless on the sidewalks, watching Bobby's truck pass. Men, women, and what appeared to be adolescents, all wearing clothes from the early 1900s, all with that same cadaveric pale skin and empty eye sockets. Bobby counted them as he drove. 5 figures on the left sidewalk, 7 on the right. 3 more standing in the middle of a side street. The count kept growing. 12, 19, 26. The inhabitants of Ashford Ironworks were coming out to observe the stranger passing through their town. Bobby's heart was hammering in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him that he was in danger, that he needed to escape this place immediately. But the narrow street gave him no room to turn around, and the buildings pressed close on both sides, creating a gauntlet he had to navigate. Bobby pressed down slightly on the accelerator, increasing his speed to 20 miles per hour, despite the rough cobblestone surface. His truck bounced and rattled, but Bobby didn't care. He needed to get through this town as quickly as possible. The GPS screen on his dash suddenly lit up, but instead of showing a map, it displayed a single line of text. No route available, location unknown. Then it went dark again. The buildings on either side of the street appeared to be a mix of commercial and industrial structures. Bobby passed what looked like a general store, with faded painted letters on the window reading, Harding's Mercantile. Next to it was a building with Ashford Bank and Trust carved into the stone above the door. A hardware store, a barber shop with its striped pole still attached to the wall, a pharmacy. These had been the businesses that served the factory workers of Ashford Ironworks, back when this was a thriving industrial town. But that had been over 100 years ago. These buildings should be ruins, if they existed at all. Yet everything looked preserved, as if time had simply stopped in 1912 and left everything frozen in place. More figures continued to appear, and Bobby noticed that they were now beginning to step off the sidewalks and move closer to the street. They didn't approach his truck directly, but they were narrowing the corridor he was driving through. Bobby saw a woman in a long, dark dress, her pale hands clasped in front of her, standing just feet from his passenger side mirror. A man in a factory worker's overalls, his empty eye sockets turned directly toward Bobby's window. A young person in a newsboy cap and knickerbockers, holding what appeared to be a stack of newspapers from 1912. All of them silent, all of them watching. None of them with eyes. Bobby realized his hands were shaking on the steering wheel. He tried his CB radio again, pressing the transmit button and speaking loudly. "This is Blue Thunder. I need emergency assistance. I'm in some kind of situation, and I need help." Static. Bobby tried his cell phone, pressing the power button repeatedly, but the device remained dead. He was completely cut off from the outside world, alone in this impossible place with its impossible inhabitants. The street ahead made a gentle curve to the right, and Bobby followed it, hoping to see an exit from the town on the other side of the curve. Instead, the street opened into a town square, a central plaza with a dry fountain in the middle and more buildings surrounding it on all four sides. Dozens of the pale figures stood around the square, all facing toward Bobby's truck as it entered. Bobby felt like he was driving into an arena, with spectators waiting to see what would happen to him. The square had 4 streets leading away from it, one on each side. Bobby tried to determine which street would lead him out of town, but they all looked identical, lined with the same old buildings, lit by the same flickering gas lamps, disappearing into the same thick fog. He made a quick decision and took the street to his left, hoping it would lead away from the center of town. His dashboard clock was now spinning wildly, numbers changing too fast to read, cycling through times that made no sense. As Bobby drove down the new street, he noticed the buildings here were different. These were larger structures, industrial buildings with tall smokestacks and loading docks. These were the actual ironworks, the factories where this town's residents had worked a century ago. Bobby could see names painted on the brick walls in faded white letters. Ashford Foundry No. 1. Ashford Steel Works. Ashford Machine Shop. The buildings extended for several blocks, creating an industrial corridor that looked exactly like photographs Bobby had seen of early 20th century American factory towns. But unlike those photographs, this place wasn't empty. Bobby saw more of the pale figures standing in front of the factory buildings, and for the first time he noticed their injuries. Some were missing limbs, arms or legs simply absent, with no visible wounds or blood, just emptiness where the limb should be. Others had visible dents or depressions in their heads or torsos, as if they had been struck by heavy machinery. Industrial accidents, Bobby realized. These were workers who had died in factory accidents, and now they were trapped here in this frozen moment of time, forever standing outside the factories where they had lost their lives. The realization made Bobby's stomach turn. He pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing his speed up to 25 miles per hour despite the dangerous cobblestone surface. He had to get out of this place. The street continued straight for what felt like forever but was probably only about 6 blocks. Then, impossibly, Bobby found himself back at the town square with the dry fountain. He had somehow driven in a complete circle despite having taken only left turns. This violated every rule of geometry, but Bobby was looking at the same square, the same fountain, the same dozens of pale figures watching him. A surge of panic threatened to overwhelm Bobby's rational mind. He was trapped in a maze with no exit, with impossible residents watching his every move. Bobby took a different street this time, the one to his right. Maybe this would lead out. But after another 6 blocks of industrial buildings and watching figures, Bobby found himself once again at the town square. He had driven straight, no turns, and yet somehow ended up back where he started. Bobby stopped his truck in the middle of the square, put it in neutral, and sat breathing heavily, trying to think. His engineer's mind tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe the streets curved in ways his depth perception couldn't detect in the fog. Maybe his sense of direction was compromised by stress, but Bobby knew that wasn't the answer. This place operated by rules that had nothing to do with normal physical laws. He was somewhere outside of regular reality, trapped in a pocket dimension or a time loop or whatever explanation fit an impossible town that shouldn't exist. Bobby sat in his truck for several minutes, engine idling, trying to formulate a plan. The pale figures around the square remained motionless, their empty eye sockets fixed on his truck. Bobby counted them. There were now over 60 visible, more than had been present the last time he was in the square. More were appearing, emerging from buildings or materializing out of the fog. The population of Ashford Ironworks was gathering, drawn by the presence of an outsider. Bobby noticed that while the figures remained on the sidewalks and did not step into the street where his truck sat, they were gradually moving closer, tightening the circle around him. Bobby put his truck back in gear and drove forward again, taking the third street, the one directly ahead that he hadn't yet tried. This street was different from the others. It was narrower, barely wide enough for his truck to fit, and lined with what appeared to be residential buildings. Two-story houses with front porches, windows dark and curtains drawn. Bobby had to reduce his speed to 10 miles per hour to navigate the narrow passage without hitting the buildings on either side. The gas lamps here were spaced farther apart, creating long stretches of shadow between pools of yellow light. And in those shadows, Bobby saw movement. Figures were following his truck, walking parallel to him on both sidewalks, keeping pace despite his truck moving at 10 miles per hour. Bobby glanced at his passenger side mirror and saw at least a dozen of the pale inhabitants walking beside his trailer, their empty eyes somehow tracking his vehicle. On the driver's side, more figures walked in unison, their footsteps silent on the cobblestone sidewalk. Bobby felt surrounded, trapped not just by the maze-like streets but by the gathering crowd of eyeless watchers. He pressed down on the accelerator, trying to pull ahead of the walking figures, but as his speed increased to 15 miles per hour, the figures matched his pace exactly. They were keeping up with him, gliding along the sidewalk with movements that looked almost like walking, but were somehow wrong, too smooth, covering too much distance with each step. Bobby pushed to 20 miles per hour. The figures accelerated with him. Bobby realized with horror that they could match any speed he chose. These things were not bound by human limitations. They could move as fast or as slow as they needed to, and right now they had chosen to escort Bobby through their town, surrounding his truck on all sides. The narrow residential street continued for what felt like miles. Bobby lost count of how many houses he passed, how many intersections with other narrow streets he drove through. The pale figures continued their silent march beside him, never falling behind, never breaking formation. Then, suddenly, the residential street opened into a large open space, and Bobby realized he was looking at the ironworks factory complex from a different angle. Massive brick buildings with tall smokestacks dominated the view, connected by what looked like elevated walkways or conveyor systems. Railroad tracks ran between the buildings, their rails rusted but still intact. This was the heart of the industrial operation, where iron ore had been smelted and forged into steel products a century ago. And standing in front of the largest building, arranged in neat rows like a factory work crew, were hundreds of the pale figures. Men in work clothes, women in long dresses, young people in factory smocks, all facing Bobby's truck, all with empty eye sockets, all completely motionless. Bobby stopped his truck and stared at the assembled crowd. This was the entire population of Ashford Ironworks, or at least the portion of it that had died in the factory disaster that closed the town in 1958. They had all gathered here to witness Bobby's presence, to observe the living man who had stumbled into their frozen world. Bobby felt an overwhelming urge to get out of his truck, to walk forward and join them, to become part of their eternal assembly. The urge was so strong that Bobby's hand actually reached for the door handle before he caught himself. No, his rational mind screamed. If you leave the truck, you'll never get back in. You'll become one of them, trapped here forever. Bobby jerked his hand away from the door and gripped the steering wheel instead. He couldn't look at the assembled figures anymore. He turned his attention to the right side of the complex, looking for a way around. There, partially obscured by fog, Bobby could see what looked like a loading area with a ramp leading up to a railroad platform. Beyond the platform, barely visible in the darkness, was what might be a road leading away from the factory complex. Bobby made his decision. He turned his wheel hard to the right and drove toward the loading area, his truck bouncing over the railroad tracks with bone-jarring impacts. The assembled figures did not move or react as Bobby drove past them. They simply stood and watched, their empty eyes following his progress. Bobby reached the loading area and saw that it was indeed a road, unpaved but wide enough for his truck. The road led away from the factory buildings, heading toward what Bobby hoped was the edge of town. He accelerated, pushing his speed up to 30 miles per hour despite the rough dirt surface. His truck rattled and shook, trailer bouncing wildly, but Bobby didn't care about comfort or cargo. He cared only about escape. The road curved to the left, then to the right, winding between piles of industrial debris and abandoned equipment. Bobby saw rusted machinery, collapsed buildings, piles of iron scrap. This was the abandoned outer edge of the factory complex, left to decay after the facility closed. And then Bobby saw it. Far ahead, maybe a quarter mile, a light that was different from the gas lamps. This was bright white light, steady and modern, cutting through the fog like a beacon. Electric light. The 21st century light of highway signs and streetlights. Bobby pressed the accelerator to the floor. His Peterbilt's engine roared, and the truck surged forward, reaching 40 miles per hour on the rough dirt road. The trailer fishtailed behind him, but Bobby held the wheel steady, his eyes locked on that distant white light. The road seemed to stretch impossibly, the light staying the same distance away no matter how fast Bobby drove. But gradually, inch by inch, it grew closer. Bobby could now see that it was indeed a modern highway light, one of the tall sodium vapor lamps that line American interstates. And beneath it, he could see smooth black asphalt, yellow lane lines, reflective mile markers. The modern world. Escape. Bobby's truck burst out of the fog and onto Interstate 76 like a rocket, his tires screeching as they hit the smooth pavement. The sudden transition from rough dirt to perfect asphalt almost caused Bobby to lose control, but he corrected the steering and managed to keep the truck in his lane. Behind him, the fog that had filled Ashford Iron Works was receding, pulling back like a living thing, disappearing into the forest that lined the highway. And in the forest, Bobby could see nothing. No dirt road, no factory buildings, no town. Just trees and darkness. Bobby drove for 5 miles before he trusted himself to pull over. He found a rest area off exit 74 and guided his truck into a parking space, his hands still trembling on the wheel. He put the truck in neutral, engaged the parking brake, and sat in silence, listening to his heart pound in his chest. Slowly, the electronic systems in his truck began to come back to life. His GPS screen lit up and displayed his location correctly. He was on Interstate 76 near the Pennsylvania-Ohio border, approximately 60 miles from Erie. His dashboard clock stopped its wild spinning and settled on a time, 11:32 p.m. Bobby checked his watch, which was old-fashioned mechanical, and had continued running normally throughout his ordeal. His watch also read 11:32. Bobby calculated in his head. He had left the loading dock in Pittsburgh at 6:32. It was now 11:32. That meant 5 hours had passed, but it had felt like much longer. Bobby's memory of the time in Ashford Iron Works was hazy, as if he had been in a dream state. How long had he actually spent driving through that town? Minutes? Hours? Bobby couldn't be certain. His CB radio crackled to life with normal trucker chatter. Bobby heard familiar voices discussing traffic conditions and weather reports. The sound of normal conversation was so comforting that Bobby almost wept. Bobby climbed down from his cab and walked around his truck, performing an inspection. The exterior looked normal, no damage to the paint or the trailer, no signs that he had driven through an impossible town on rough cobblestone streets. But when Bobby climbed up on the trailer to check the roof, he found something that made his blood run cold. Scratched into the roof of his trailer, as if someone had dragged a metal tool across the surface, were letters. Bobby couldn't read them from his angle, so he climbed back down and took a photograph with his phone, now working again with full battery. Then he enlarged the image and rotated it. The scratches spelled out a single word in rough, uneven letters: return. Bobby stared at the photograph for a long time. The message was clear. Whatever force controlled Ashford Iron Works wanted him to come back. Bobby deleted the photograph, climbed back into his cab, and resumed his drive to Detroit. He arrived at the Ford assembly plant at 2:15 in the morning, still well ahead of his 8 o'clock delivery window. The receiving clerk who processed his paperwork asked Bobby why he looked so shaken. Bobby lied and said he'd had a close call with a deer on the highway. The clerk accepted the explanation and processed the delivery. Bobby was unloaded, given his signed receipt, and sent on his way by 3:30 a.m. Bobby should have driven straight home to Philadelphia. Instead, 3 days later, he found himself back in northwestern Pennsylvania, driving the same route he had taken before. He needed to know if Ashford Iron Works was real, if the shortcut existed, if the town could be found. Bobby drove State Route 423 north from Pittsburgh, counting mile markers carefully. When he reached mile marker 32, where the wooden sign had indicated the shortcut, Bobby slowed to a crawl and searched the roadside. There was nothing, no sign. No turnoff, just solid forest on both sides of the highway. Bobby drove another 5 miles, thinking perhaps he had miscounted markers. Still nothing. He turned around and drove back south, checking the opposite side of the highway. No shortcut, no sign, no indication that a road had ever existed there. Bobby pulled over and consulted his GPS, zooming in on the area. The satellite view showed only unbroken forest. No roads, no clearings, no town. Bobby spent the next 6 hours driving every state highway in the region, searching for any trace of the Iron Gate or the cobblestone streets. He found nothing. Ashford Iron Works had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Frustrated and exhausted, Bobby finally gave up and began the drive home to Philadelphia. But his mind wouldn't let go of what he had experienced. He needed answers. He needed to understand what he had seen. Over the next 2 weeks, Bobby became obsessed with researching Ashford Iron Works. He started with online searches and quickly discovered that the town had been real. Wikipedia had a short article describing it as an industrial settlement founded in 1912 by the Ashford Steel Company. The town had prospered through the 1920s and 30s, with a population reaching approximately 800 residents at its peak. But in 1958, there had been a disaster. A catastrophic explosion in the main foundry had killed dozens of workers and released toxic gases that forced the evacuation of the entire town. The government had declared the site too contaminated to rehabilitate, and the population had been permanently relocated. In 1962, the remaining buildings were demolished, and the land was returned to forest. That was the official story. But Bobby wanted more details. He drove to Pittsburgh and spent a full day at the Carnegie Library, searching through historical newspaper archives on microfilm. He found several articles about Ashford Iron Works from the 1950s, including coverage of the 1958 disaster. But the articles were vague about what had actually happened, using phrases like industrial accident of unknown cause and area rendered uninhabitable. There were no photographs of the disaster scene, no interviews with survivors, no detailed investigation reports. It was as if the story had been deliberately suppressed or sanitized. Then Bobby found the first article about the missing family. It was buried in the October 28, 1930 edition of the Pittsburgh Gazette, a single column on page 8. The headline read, Family vanishes en route to Philadelphia. Bobby read the article with growing recognition. The Hartwell family, consisting of Walter Hartwell, age 37, his wife Margaret, age 34, and their two sons Thomas, age 12, and James, age 8, had left Pittsburgh on October 20th, 1930, driving to Philadelphia in their Ford Model A automobile. They planned to arrive by the evening of October 21st, but they never showed up at their destination. A search was launched, and on October 26th, their car was discovered parked on a remote state highway in northwestern Pennsylvania. The car was locked, the engine was cold, and all of the family's luggage was still inside. But there was no sign of the Hartwell family themselves. An extensive search of the surrounding forest found no traces, no footprints, no evidence of where they had gone. The case was investigated as a possible abduction, but no witnesses came forward and no ransom demands were received. After 6 months, the investigation was closed with no resolution, and the Hartwell family was declared legally missing. Bobby made a copy of the article and continued searching. He found a few follow-up pieces from 1931, reporting that the case remained unsolved. Then nothing. The Hartwell family had simply vanished from history. Bobby continued his search through the newspaper archives, moving forward in time, looking for any other mention of disappearances or strange occurrences near Ashford Iron Works. He found nothing significant until he reached the year 2000. In the digital archives of the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, Bobby discovered a police report filed on September 14, 2000. The report described an incident involving a truck driver named Michael Chen, age 43, employed by Transnational Freight Services. According to the report, Chen had contacted Pennsylvania State Police on September 13th, claiming he had become lost in a town that does not exist on any map. Chen's account, as recorded in the police report, was remarkably similar to Bobby's experience. Chen described taking what he thought was a shortcut to avoid traffic, driving through a town with old-fashioned architecture and residents who appeared deceased but were moving, and eventually finding his way back to a modern highway after hours of driving in circles. Chen was visibly distressed when interviewed by police and insisted his story was true. However, when officers accompanied Chen back to the location where he claimed to have entered the mysterious town, they found only forest. No road, no town, no indication that such a place existed. Chen was referred for a psychiatric evaluation by the department's Occupational Health Services. Bobby found the psychiatric evaluation report attached to the police file. A Dr. Patricia Morrison had interviewed Chen on September 20th, 2000, and diagnosed him with acute stress reaction with dissociative features, likely induced by extended driving fatigue and occupational stress. Dr. Morrison's notes indicated that Chen had been driving for 11 hours straight when the incident occurred, and she believed he had experienced a complex hallucination or waking dream state that felt real but was entirely a product of his exhausted mind. She recommended Chen take 2 weeks of leave from driving and undergo counseling before returning to work. Chen had complied with these recommendations and been cleared to resume driving on October 5, 2000. Then, on December 28, 2000, Michael Chen disappeared. Bobby found the missing person report in the Pennsylvania State Police database. Chen had been making a routine delivery run from Columbus, Ohio to Philadelphia when he vanished. His truck was found abandoned on Interstate 76 at approximately 3:30 in the morning on December 29th. The truck was parked in the breakdown lane with the engine running, headlights on, and driver's door standing open. Chen's wallet, phone, and personal belongings were all inside the cab. The trailer was still sealed and contained its full load of freight. But Michael Chen himself was gone. An extensive search of the area around the abandoned truck found no trace of Chen. There were no footprints leading away from the vehicle, no signs of a struggle, no blood or other evidence of foul play. Chen had simply vanished into thin air. The investigation remained open for 6 months, but with no leads and no evidence, it was eventually classified as an unsolved missing person case. Bobby stared at the report, feeling a chill run through his body. The location where Chen's truck had been found was exit 74 on Interstate 76. That was exactly where Bobby had emerged from Ashford Iron Works, and exactly where Bobby had stopped at the rest area after his escape. The same location. Bobby tried to find any information about Chen's family, hoping to contact them for more details. But Chen had been unmarried with no close relatives, and Bobby's attempts to locate former co-workers or friends were unsuccessful. Chen had apparently been a solitary person whose life had revolved around trucking. When he disappeared, there were few people to notice or care. Bobby did manage to track down Chen's former employer, Transnational Freight Services, but the company had gone out of business in 2003. Their records had been destroyed, and Bobby could find no one who remembered Chen specifically. With the Chen trail going cold, Bobby returned to researching the Hartwell family from 1930. He managed to locate descendants of Walter Hartwell's brother, who had lived in Pittsburgh and had children after the Hartwell family disappeared. Bobby contacted a woman named Linda Hartwell Morrison, great-niece of the missing Walter Hartwell, who lived in a suburb of Pittsburgh. Bobby explained that he was researching historical missing person cases and asked if Linda knew anything about her great-uncle's disappearance. Linda agreed to meet with Bobby at a coffee shop. She was a woman in her early 60s, a retired school teacher who had always been interested in her family's history. She brought with her a folder of old documents and photographs related to the Hartwells. "It's the family mystery that was never solved," Linda told Bobby as she spread photographs on the table. "My grandfather, Walter's brother, spent years trying to find out what happened to them. He hired private investigators, offered rewards, contacted psychics, everything you can imagine. But there was never any trace. It was like they drove into thin air and were just erased." Linda showed Bobby a photograph of the Hartwell family, taken in summer 1930. They looked happy and normal, a typical American family of that era. "Did your grandfather ever mention anything unusual about where the car was found?" Bobby asked carefully. Linda nodded slowly. "Actually, yes. He told my mother before he died that the police had been reluctant to discuss certain details of the case. Apparently, when they found the car, there was something strange about it. My grandfather saw the police photographs, and he said the car looked like it had been somewhere other than a normal road. The tires were covered in what looked like cobblestone dust, as if it had been driven on old-fashioned paving stones. But the area where the car was found was all modern asphalt highways. There was no place within 100 miles that still had cobblestone streets." Bobby felt his hands start to shake. He put them under the table so Linda wouldn't notice. "Did your grandfather have any theory about what happened?" Linda leaned forward and lowered her voice. "This is going to sound crazy, but toward the end of his life, my grandfather became convinced that his brother had driven into some kind of, he called it a gap in the world. A place that shouldn't exist but does, that traps people and doesn't let them leave. He said he had found mentions in old folklore about places like that, towns that appear on roads at night and lure travelers in. Ghost towns, but not ghost towns. Places that are real but exist outside of normal space and time." She paused and looked embarrassed. "I know that sounds like nonsense. My grandfather had had a stroke and wasn't always clear in his thinking toward the end. But he was absolutely convinced. He made my mother promise to never ever take shortcuts on country roads at night. He said that's how you end up in these places, by leaving the main highways and going into the back roads." Bobby left his meeting with Linda Hartwell Morrison with his mind racing. 2 documented cases spanning 7 decades, both involving disappearances connected to mysterious towns or places that shouldn't exist. Bobby knew there had to be more cases, but after hours of additional research, he found nothing. It was as if someone had scrubbed all other records clean, leaving only these 2 isolated incidents as evidence. Bobby tried searching for any historical or folklore references to disappearing towns or trap locations, but most of what he found was obvious fiction or urban legends with no factual basis. There were stories about phantom towns that appeared in the mist, or time slip phenomena where people accidentally entered the past, but these were all presented as entertainment, not serious documentation of real events. Bobby was beginning to feel like he was losing his grip on reality. Maybe Dr. Morrison had been right about Michael Chen. Maybe these experiences were just hallucinations brought on by driving fatigue and stress. Maybe Bobby's own experience had been a dream, and the scratches on his trailer roof had some mundane explanation he was overlooking. But Bobby knew what he had seen. He knew what he had experienced. Ashford Iron Works was real, and it was still out there, waiting for the next person to take a shortcut off the main highway. Bobby made a decision. He would try to find the town again, but this time he would be prepared. He bought a dash camera system and installed it in his truck, positioning cameras to record both the road ahead and the interior of his cab. He bought a portable GPS tracker that would record his exact position at all times, even if his truck's systems went haywire. He packed emergency supplies, food, water, flares, a portable radio, extra batteries, even a compass. If he encountered Ashford Iron Works again, he would document everything. And if he couldn't escape, at least the cameras would record what happened to him. Over the next month, Bobby made 4 deliberate trips to northwestern Pennsylvania, driving State Route 423 and every other back road in the region, always at night, always alone. He drove through fog and rain, through clear nights and cloudy nights, taking every unmarked turnoff he could find. But Ashford Iron Works did not appear. Bobby began to wonder if the town only revealed itself under specific conditions, or only to specific people. Maybe it chose its victims somehow, waited for the right combination of circumstances before opening its gates. Maybe Bobby had been lucky to escape once, and the town would not give him a second chance to document it. Bobby's obsession began to affect his work. He turned down good-paying loads because they didn't route through Pennsylvania. He took unprofitable runs just so he could spend more time searching the back roads. His bank account dwindled, and his dispatch supervisor started asking questions about his declining performance. Bobby knew he was on a path toward losing his career, but he couldn't stop. He had to understand what Ashford Iron Works was, had to find out if the Hartwell family and Michael Chen were still there, had to know if he could somehow help them escape, or at least give their families closure. On December 3rd, 2022, almost a month after his original encounter, Bobby was driving State Route 423 for what must have been the 20th time. It was 2 in the morning, the night was foggy, and Bobby was exhausted from a full day of driving. His dash cameras were recording, his GPS tracker was active, and he had his emergency supplies packed in the sleeper berth. As Bobby approached mile marker 32, he saw something that made his heart leap. The wooden sign was back. Shortcut to Route 19, 5 miles. Bobby slowed his truck to a crawl, staring at the sign. It looked exactly as he remembered, weathered and barely legible. The narrow road it indicated was there, stretching into the fog between dark trees. This was it. This was his chance to document everything, to prove that Ashford Iron Works was real, to maybe find answers about the missing people. Bobby could turn onto that road right now, and within 20 minutes he would be driving through the Iron Gate into the impossible town. But as Bobby sat with his truck idling, his hand on the turn signal, he realized something. He was terrified. Not just nervous or apprehensive, but filled with genuine terror at the thought of entering that place again. His rational mind told him that going back was insane, that he had escaped once and might not escape a second time. The scratches on his trailer roof said return, but that didn't mean returning was a good idea. Maybe it was a trap, an invitation that would seal his doom. Bobby remembered the assembled hundreds of eyeless figures at the factory complex, remembered the feeling that if he left his truck, he would join them forever. He remembered driving in circles, unable to find an exit, the growing panic and desperation. Did he really want to experience that again? Even with his cameras and GPS and emergency supplies, Bobby would still be alone and vulnerable in a place that operated by rules he didn't understand. If something happened to him, if he disappeared like the Hartwells and like Michael Chen, his cameras would probably stop working just like all his other electronics had stopped working. No one would ever know what happened to him. Bobby would just become another unsolved missing person case, another statistic in the long list of people who vanish without a trace. Bobby's hand moved to the turn signal stalk, ready to flip it on and commit to the turn. But then a voice in his head, sounding remarkably like his ex-wife Patricia, said simply, "Don't be stupid. You got out once. That's more than most people can say. Don't push your luck." Bobby's hand stopped. He sat there for a long moment, truck idling, staring at the wooden sign and the dark road beyond. Then, with a feeling that was equal parts relief and regret, Bobby pressed down on the accelerator and drove past the turnoff. He didn't take the shortcut. He continued on State Route 423, following it all the way to Route 19, then to Erie, then back to Pittsburgh. He never looked back, though the temptation to turn around was almost overwhelming. Bobby drove straight home to Philadelphia, arriving at dawn. He unloaded his emergency supplies from the truck, backed up the footage from his dash cameras to his computer, and went to bed. When he woke up 12 hours later, Bobby made another decision. He would stop looking for Ashford Iron Works. He had documented what he could, researched what he could, and confirmed that at least 2 other people had experienced similar events. That would have to be enough. Bobby couldn't save the Hartwells or Michael Chen. He couldn't solve the mystery of what Ashford Iron Works really was or why it existed. All he could do was survive and try to warn others. Bobby created a simple website on one of those free hosting platforms. He called it the Ashford account and posted his full story, including scanned copies of the newspaper articles about the Hartwell family and the police reports about Michael Chen. He posted his dash cam footage from his drives through northwestern Pennsylvania, though the footage showed nothing unusual, just normal nighttime driving. He didn't have any footage from inside Ashford Iron Works because his cameras had stopped working when he entered the town. The website was basic and ugly, but it was public and searchable. Bobby hoped that other truckers who encountered strange towns or impossible locations might find it and realize they weren't alone. He included a warning at the top of the page. If you see a shortcut sign on State Route 423 in northwestern Pennsylvania after dark, do not take it. If you enter a town with an iron gate marked Ashford Iron Works, keep driving. Do not stop. Do not get out of your vehicle. Follow the streetlights, find the white light at the edge of town, and get back to a modern highway as fast as you can. If you can't find your way out, stay in your vehicle and wait for dawn. Never, under any circumstances, leave your vehicle while inside. Bobby included his email address at the bottom of the page for anyone who wanted to contact him. Within a week, he received his first message. It was from a trucker named Dale Morrison, who claimed to have had a similar experience in Nebraska in 1998. Dale described driving through what he called a town that was stuck in the past, with old cars and people in outdated clothing. He managed to escape and never spoke about it publicly until seeing Bobby's website. Over the next 6 months, Bobby received a dozen more messages from drivers across the United States describing encounters with impossible towns, time slips, or places that shouldn't exist. Not all the stories match Bobby's experience exactly, but they shared common elements: taking shortcuts off main highways, entering towns with architecture from decades past, experiencing electronic failures, encountering strange residents, and having difficulty finding exits. Bobby compiled all these accounts on his website, creating a database of reported incidents. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. These phenomena weren't limited to Pennsylvania. They happened across America, particularly in rural areas along old highways and back roads, and they had been happening for decades, possibly centuries. Most people who encountered these places never reported them, either because they thought they had hallucinated or because they were too frightened to speak publicly. Those who did report their experiences were usually dismissed as suffering from fatigue or mental illness. But Bobby now had evidence that this was a real, recurring phenomenon that affected multiple people across different locations and time periods. He tried to contact paranormal investigators, academic researchers, even government agencies about his findings. Most ignored him, A few responded with polite dismissals. One university professor of folklore expressed interest and interviewed Bobby at length, but ultimately concluded that the stories represented a new form of urban legend spreading through the trucking community, not actual supernatural events. Bobby was frustrated but not surprised. Without physical proof, without photographs or video from inside these towns, his evidence was just anecdotal testimony. And testimonies, no matter how many there were, could always be explained away. Bobby tried to move on with his life. He continued driving trucks, but he stayed on major interstates and refused to take any shortcuts or back roads. He avoided northwestern Pennsylvania entirely, routing around it even when it added hours to his trips. Dispatch thought he was being superstitious, but they accommodated his requests. Bobby's obsession with Ashford Iron Works gradually faded from the forefront of his mind, becoming something he thought about occasionally, but no longer actively pursued. His website remained online, and he still received occasional messages from other drivers, but Bobby stopped adding new content or investigating further. He had done what he could. The warning was out there for anyone who wanted to listen. That should have been the end of Bobby's story. But on March 17th, 2023, 4 months after Bobby had last searched for Ashford Iron Works, he was driving through northwestern Pennsylvania on Interstate 76. He had a delivery to Erie and couldn't avoid the region without adding an entire day to his trip. It was 2 in the afternoon, broad daylight, and Bobby felt safe on the major interstate surrounded by traffic. But as Bobby approached exit 74, the same exit where Michael Chen's truck had been found abandoned, Bobby saw something that made his blood turn to ice. On the shoulder of the interstate, just before the exit ramp, was a figure. A man in old-fashioned clothing standing motionless, watching the traffic pass. Bobby's truck was in the center lane, about 50 feet from the shoulder, but the distance was close enough that Bobby could see details as he drove past. The man's skin was unnaturally pale. His eye sockets were empty voids. He wore the same factory worker's overalls Bobby had seen in Ashford Iron Works. And as Bobby's truck passed him, the figure's head turned to follow, tracking Bobby's movement with those impossible eyeless sockets. Bobby accelerated hard, weaving between other vehicles as he put distance between himself and that impossible figure. He checked his mirrors, but the figure had disappeared from view, either because Bobby had driven far enough away, or because it had simply vanished. Bobby's hands were shaking so badly, he had to pull over at the next rest area to calm down. This was different. This was wrong on a new level. The inhabitants of Ashford Iron Works had stayed within their town before. They had never appeared outside its boundaries. If they were now manifesting on modern highways in broad daylight, that meant the rules had changed. The barriers between Ashford Iron Works and the real world were breaking down. Or maybe, Bobby thought with growing horror, the town was expanding its territory. Bobby drove straight home to Philadelphia without completing his delivery. He called dispatch and lied, saying he had a family emergency. Then he spent 3 days researching, trying to find reports of other sightings of pale figures with empty eye sockets appearing on highways. He found nothing concrete, but he did find increasing numbers of reports on paranormal forums about ghost hitchhikers and phantom pedestrians seen near exit 74 on Interstate 76. Some of the descriptions matched what Bobby had seen. Bobby updated his website with this new information and included a warning. The entities from Ashford Iron Works may now be appearing outside the town boundaries. Exercise extreme caution when driving through northwestern Pennsylvania, particularly near exit 74 on Interstate 76. If you see any pale figures on the roadside, do not stop and do not make eye contact. Bobby included photographs he had taken of the area, though none showed any figures. Bobby tried to contact the Pennsylvania State Police to report what he had seen, but they had no mechanism for accepting reports of supernatural sightings. Bobby tried to contact local news outlets, but none were interested in a story about ghost hitchhikers without video evidence. Bobby was hitting the same walls he had hit before. Without proof, no one would take him seriously. Then, on April 9th, 2023, Bobby received an email that changed everything. It was from a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who identified herself as the daughter of Michael Chen, the truck driver who had disappeared in 2000. Sarah had found Bobby's website while researching her father's case and wanted to meet with Bobby to discuss what had happened. Bobby agreed immediately. They met at a diner in Pittsburgh 2 days later. Sarah Chen was a woman in her early 40s, a physician working at a hospital in Columbus, Ohio. She had been only 20 when her father disappeared, and she had never accepted the official explanation that he had simply walked away from his life. Sarah had kept her father's case active in her mind for 23 years, periodically following up with police and searching for any new information. When she found Bobby's website and read about Ashford Iron Works, she immediately recognized the similarities to what her father had described before his disappearance. "My father called me the night before he vanished," Sarah told Bobby, her voice tight with emotion. "It was about 1 in the morning, and he was really shaken up. He told me he had gotten lost in a town that didn't make sense, where everyone looked dead but was still walking around. He said his truck's electronics had gone crazy, and he drove in circles for hours before finding his way out. He made me promise not to tell anyone because he was afraid people would think he was crazy." Bobby leaned forward, his heart racing. "Did he describe the town? Did he mention a name?" Sarah nodded. "He said there was an iron gate with a name on it. He couldn't remember the exact name, but it was something about ironworks or forge. He said the town looked like it was from 100 years ago, with gas lamps and old buildings. And the people, he described them exactly like you did on your website. Pale skin, no eyes, wearing old-fashioned clothes. My father was terrified. He told me he was going to avoid that area of Pennsylvania forever." Sarah pulled out a folder containing documents. 3 months after that phone call, my father disappeared. His truck was found on Interstate 76 near Exit 74. The police said he probably had a mental breakdown and walked away, but my father wouldn't do that. He loved his job. He loved his life. There's no way he would just vanish voluntarily. Bobby felt a chill run through him. "Sarah, I think your father went back. Either he accidentally took another shortcut and ended up in Ashford Iron Works again, or the town came to him. I saw one of the inhabitants on the interstate near that same exit. Maybe they can leave the town now. Maybe they can take people." Sarah and Bobby spent hours discussing theories about what Ashford Iron Works really was. Sarah, with her medical and scientific background, approached it analytically. She suggested it might be a form of mass hallucination or shared delusion triggered by specific environmental conditions in that region of Pennsylvania. Maybe there was a geological feature that released gases causing hallucinations. Maybe electromagnetic anomalies affected brain function. Bobby appreciated her attempts to find rational explanations, but he knew what he had experienced was real. The scratches on his trailer roof had been real. The 2 hours he spent trapped in that town had been real, and the dozens of other drivers who had reported similar experiences weren't all suffering from identical hallucinations. This was something else, something that existed in a space between dimensions or time periods. Sarah eventually conceded that conventional explanations didn't fit all the facts. Together, they developed a plan. They would organize an expedition to northwestern Pennsylvania with proper equipment, multiple cameras, GPS trackers, electromagnetic field detectors, radiation sensors, everything they could think of to document any phenomena they encountered. They would drive the back roads systematically, looking for the shortcut sign, prepared to enter Ashford Iron Works if the opportunity presented itself. The goal was to gather undeniable proof that would force authorities to take the phenomenon seriously and potentially investigate what had happened to Michael Chen and others who had disappeared. But as Bobby and Sarah began recruiting other people to join their expedition, they encountered resistance. Most of the truckers who had contacted Bobby about their own experiences refused to participate, saying they had no desire to return to the places that had terrified them. Paranormal investigators who might have been interested wanted payment for their time, and Bobby and Sarah couldn't afford their fees. Academic researchers dismissed the idea as pseudoscience. After weeks of trying, Bobby and Sarah had to abandon the organized expedition idea. They would have to investigate on their own. On May 15, 2023, Bobby and Sarah drove to northwestern Pennsylvania together. Sarah had taken a week off from her hospital job, and Bobby had cleared his delivery schedule. They packed Bobby's truck with equipment and supplies, prepared for an extended search of the region's back roads. But despite 3 full days of driving every secondary highway, state route, and rural road in the area, they found nothing. No shortcut sign, no iron gate, no Ashford Ironworks. The town remained hidden, accessible only according to rules Bobby and Sarah didn't understand. They returned home disappointed, but determined to try again. Over the following months, Bobby made 4 more trips to Pennsylvania, sometimes with Sarah and sometimes alone. Each time, Ashford Ironworks eluded him. Bobby began to suspect that the town only appeared under specific conditions, maybe only to specific people. Perhaps it had already claimed him once and wouldn't give him another chance. Or perhaps it was waiting for the right moment to draw him in permanently. Bobby's life continued, but Ashford Ironworks was never far from his thoughts. He kept his website updated with new reports from other drivers. He corresponded with Sarah about her father's case. And sometimes, late at night when he was alone in his truck on a dark highway, Bobby would think about the pale figures with empty eye sockets, still walking the cobblestone streets of a town that shouldn't exist, waiting for the next traveler to stumble through their iron gate. Bobby never did find Ashford Ironworks again, but he knows it's still out there, somewhere between the world we see and the world that exists in the shadows of back roads and shortcuts. The Hartwell family from 1930 is still there, driving their Model A through eternal streets. Michael Chen is still there, trapped in his endless delivery run. And someday, Bobby knows, another driver will take a shortcut to save time. We'll see a weathered wooden sign promising a faster route, and we'll pass through an iron gate marked Ashford Ironworks, Esther 1912. That driver will experience the same terror Bobby experienced, will fight the same desperate battle to escape. And maybe, if they're lucky and smart and determined, they'll make it out. But Bobby knows that not everyone does. Not everyone can. Some people enter Ashford Ironworks and never leave, becoming permanent residents of a town that exists in a frozen moment of time, forever walking streets lit by gas lamps, forever watched by hundreds of eyeless inhabitants who were once travelers themselves. Bobby Castellano still drives trucks. He still maintains his website, still warns others about the dangers of shortcuts on back roads, still hopes that someday someone will find proof that can't be dismissed or explained away. And every time Bobby drives through northwestern Pennsylvania, he watches his mirrors carefully, looking for pale figures on the roadside, listening for the sound of gas lamps hissing in the fog, waiting for the moment when he might glimpse, just for a second, that iron gate standing open in the mist. Because Bobby knows the truth that keeps him awake on lonely nights. The door to Ashford Ironworks never truly closes. It's always there, waiting at the edge of perception, ready to open for the next traveler who strays from the main highway. And once you've been there, once you've driven those cobblestone streets and looked into those empty eye sockets, a part of you never really leaves. Bobby still sees them sometimes, in his peripheral vision when he's driving at night. Pale figures standing at the roadside, watching, waiting, calling him back to the town where time stopped and the dead walk forever. Someday, Bobby suspects, he might answer that call. Someday the temptation to return, to finally understand what Ashford Ironworks really is, might be too strong to resist. But not today. Today, Bobby drives on, following the lights of the modern highway, staying in his lane, keeping his distance from shortcuts and back roads that promise to save time but might cost everything. And he hopes that you, if you're ever driving through rural Pennsylvania late at night, will remember his warning. If you see a shortcut sign, if you pass through an iron gate, If you find yourself in a town that looks like it's from another century, don't stop. Don't leave your vehicle. And whatever you do, don't look too long into those empty eyes, because Ashford Ironworks is always hungry, and it never forgets a face.